This week, Patrick Garrity joins us from VulnCheck to talk about vulnerability tracking and prioritization. Stay tuned for Below the Surface, coming up next. Welcome, everyone, to Below the Surface, episode number 38, being recorded on Wednesday, September 18th, 2024. I'm your host, Paul Ascadorian, joined by Alan Alford. Alan, welcome.
Howdy.
What's going on, man? Hey, this week I've got show notes up on my monitor. It's a beautiful thing. Now I can tell the listeners to visit eclipsium.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. Of course, if you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo, all at eclipsium.com/go. Patrick Garrity is here with us. Patrick, welcome to the show.
What's up? Thanks for having me. This is first time on this show, so it's exciting.
I know, right? It seems like eons ago I interviewed you on the Paul Security Weekly show. Now you're here on Below the Surface. You're at a different gig now. You're living the startup life, man. So you're probably wearing a lot of hats over there at VulnCheck, right?
Yeah. This is the fifth startup I think I've done now. Fourth.
My goodness.
All successful, but like everyone is like sub 20 people pretty much. It's fun. It's really fun to build them and be a part at the early stage. So
yeah, I enjoy the content that you create. It's often relevant to my interests as, I look at firmware and supply chain vulnerabilities and threats, but then I'm also looking at where we get a lot of that vulnerability data from for a lot of reasons. Like I comb through it and look for things that are relevant to our interests here at Eclipsium. I like to see how things are being categorized, prioritized, and how people are thinking about prioritizing remediation. So I want to start, Patrick, and ask you, there's a lot of sources where you can get vulnerability data from. I feel like this is like the exact world you live in, right? And like some of these sources aren't great, right? Like some of them aren't great. Some of them are open. Some of them are commercial. Some of them are, U.S. government backed, like the NVD. So what's your thoughts? Like help us understand the landscape behind all these different vulnerability feeds we have at our disposal.
Yeah, a lot of people like the interesting thing is like, why does VulnCheck even exist if all this information is out there? And I think it's kind of interesting. It's like, you're exactly right. A vuln enthusiast or someone that's interested, even new to vulnerability management, a lot of times will like go grab SysAkev and NVD and a few things. Usually they get to like 5 or 10 things and they're just like, oh man, there's 400 more. And I'm kind of bored now of trying to collect all this information.
Right.
Because it's literally all over the place in different levels of reliability. And so, essentially we're collecting, I think at this point, like 400 to 500 different sources. And then, aggregating, normalizing, and then enriching that. And so, a lot like
wait, did you say you're collecting 400 to 500 different sources?
Oh yeah.
Oh wow!
And,
I didn't
like part of that too is making those sources available to organizations and customers.
Mm-hmm.
So we aggregate a lot of that into like feeds. So our own version of NVD,
sure.
For instance, which includes that, but there's a lot of information you can actually capture from all these different sources. That gets really interesting. And probably like this year, top thing for us is known exploited vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And I mean, this kind of goes back to like last year when I was like sending kevs to CISA, and they sometimes would put them on SysAkev and they sometimes wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
But I was fortunate when I came to VulnCheck, like they already had a kev internally. And so I've gotten to like spend a lot of time in looking for more and more sources of exploitation evidence and where that information can get
That's a
found.
great point. I want to stop right there. I want to hone in on that because known exploited vulnerabilities, and I had this conversation with Todd Beardsley from CISA, and you know Todd as well, right? I was like,
they're great.
Yeah, he's doing. They're doing awesome. Great work there, right? But we had the conversation of what does known mean? Like how do you figure out that it was exploited in the wild, and where does that data come from? Great answer for that. Obviously, when I chat with you, Patrick, right, there's other sources that you can get information. What are some of those other sources, and how do we validate them?
Well, I mean, I've spent a lot of time collecting too. So I think there's like, okay, Microsoft MSRC marks it as exploited, like automate that and put it on our Kev.
Yeah.
CISA says that it's exploited. There are 4 today. There are older vulns. Like, that's enough evidence to say, yes, that's known to be exploited. There's other sources. I think like this year we've added some like patch stack. Like there's specific knowledge in WordPress, and they have a known exploited vulnerability marker on a lot of their advisories. Where it gets a little bit gray is the terminology people use and then where you're sourcing from. So like, hey, can we trust this source? And so not everything, we try and automate collection of everything, but when we're talking about Kev, a lot of times, we're analyzing a report. There's a ton of different companies like F5 and Fortinet that issue reports on known exploitation, but like you actually have to read that report to capture that.
Yes.
And a big part of what the work we're doing is we provide CISA or VulnCheck Kev for free, but we include all the references so you can say like, do I want to trust this myself or not? And I think it's really interesting. Like the more references you get, the more you probably should even care about it more.
Right.
Yeah. I think we might have had this conversation or with someone else too, that's a factor in the equation is the number of references that a given entry would have, right?
I think you spoke to Jay Jacobs, and it's like EPSS, one of the highest weighted things is certainly references. But that's just like bulk references. I'm talking about references of known exploitation. And then one other thing, like I have a chart, like we're talking hundreds of sources of disclosure of known exploitation, but like Shadow Server is a nonprofit honeypot network that's amazing and spinning up new honeypots and capturing exploitation evidence on those honeypots. So it's just it's really like a worldwide effort of like security researchers, organizations getting product disclosures, and then some centralized functions as well that are capturing that type of evidence, right?
It's interesting to think about what it means when we say there's an exploit for it versus it's used in the wild versus what type of exploit it is. Patrick, you had what I thought was a really great explanation of what weaponized means in this context, right? Because this term started getting thrown around. I forget where. Some report was talking about weaponization. And I was like, well, that could mean a lot of things to a lot of people. But you describe it in great detail in a post on your website, right? Weaponized vulnerabilities are those with explicit malicious intent, historic malware usage, prior reports of exploitation, or inclusion in point-and-click exploitation framework kits. I think you go on from there, right? But even just that first sentence is like, to me, that can be summarized as there's an exploit that works. Right. Not just a proof of concept is really the big delineation there, right?
Yeah, and they're like, I talk a lot because we have a team of developers that we build exploits and detection artifacts, right? And so, it's like I don't claim to be the expert in writing exploits or detections, but the people on our team do. A lot of them worked on the Metasploit project, and then we have our own Go exploit framework. And I mean, that's really the thing is it's like we're talking about something being to a point where it can be used maliciously, and can deliver some form of payload as well. And then, how you categorize that. There's things that are, people sometimes do put in weaponization that maybe isn't that exact definition. I think nuclei templates are an example of that, where they're more like a scanner. So
they're more
like
they're more like an exploit exists, therefore it's on there, which I'm not saying is wrong or necessarily a bad thing. You just have to know when you contextualize and bring that information in that that's what they mean, which is why I
Yeah,
love having these conversations, right?
I do want to
Alan,
drill in
jump
on one thing you said though, Patrick, which is the payload piece. Is that a requisite for the definition, or is that a might also be?
I'm pretty sure, and I could check back. Sorry, let me pull this up because, what I try and do in all my research is like making sure that I have definitions.
Yeah, yeah.
So you're asking a good question, but I
Because
want to be
sometimes, I mean, if you
specific.
think through, like,
Yeah,
sometimes payload is not the goal. Sometimes the malicious binary is just simply
yeah,
gain me access and I'll manually come in and do whatever I want to do. Or it's a DDoS, or it's a, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm
Yeah,
picturing all the
denial of
scenarios where
service.
payload is
Yeah,
not part of the
yeah.
kill chain, right?
So with this, explicit malicious intent, historical malware usage, prior reports of exploitation. Yeah, so I guess maybe terminology wise, the payload is a bit further. Um, Ransomware would be a good example
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
of something in that. So yeah, thanks for clarifying.
All right, sorry, I just
Yeah,
a little.
one of the things, like whenever I'm researching, right, it's like these definitions and making sure that people understand like what we're saying is really important to me. Because a lot of times like this terminology is thrown around and there isn't clear definitions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think that everyone's going to agree on specifically like what's inclusive of a definition.
Sure.
But as long as in the research, like when I'm doing it, it's really clear, like it includes these things. That's the more important piece, right?
Yeah.
So
The
yeah,
delineation to me that seems to be the valuable piece is, Paul told me he cracked it last weekend versus Lazarus Group was seen on the internet doing it, right? Like, okay, Paul
yeah,
said, oh, look, the internet shows it, right? For any given value of Paul, I'm not picking on Paul in particular. I know for a fact he
no,
could,
I know.
he could
Yeah,
crack it, right? But
no, I know where you're going, but that's an interesting point, Alan. I think a great topic to discuss is the individual who created an exploit, used it on one target, and therefore is like, this is exploitable. Maybe
yeah,
released it, maybe didn't. Maybe we just have artifacts, but we don't have the
mm-hmm,
actual
yeah,
exploit.
yeah,
Versus something being used in the wild by
right.
a group of malicious actors, whether
Because
they're nation state or not. A group of malicious actors using it as part of malware is a different threat scenario to deal with as an
yeah,
organization. No,
and I forget the gentleman's name that built Metasploit. He's an Austin guy.
HD Moore. Mm-hmm.
HD
HD Moore,
more.
right?
Yeah,
So imagine it was HD who said I did it versus
yeah,
Paul, right? Like, I mean, there's a reputational factor, but there's also multiplicity factor, is what I'm getting
Mm-hmm.
at. And to me, you have to ignore reputational and stick with multiplicity, unless it's a really definitive source. In which case, who is the definitive source, right? Like, CIA says they've done it. Lazarus Group claims they've done it. I mean, you know what I mean? Like,
Well,
where's
and
the
this is why having additional evidence, but I don't think we have to get too caught in this. Like,
Mhm.
if you put it in perspective, it's like, okay, there's 250,000 vulns, I don't know,
Yeah.
give or take, and it's like, okay, like maybe let's say 6,000, 8,000 of them are weaponized, right?
Hmm.
Like 3,000 of them roughly are known to be exploited. Like we're still talking about very small numbers as far as percentage.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, you should go focus on fixing those things. Now, where terminology gets mixed a lot of times is someone says like, this vulnerability could be exploited by an attacker. So you have to, that's when
Always.
human analysis comes in very
Yeah.
often with us, is like, we're reading all these sources. So if MSRC, right, Microsoft says this is being exploited, we trust them.
Hmm.
If CISA says that, like pretty definitive source, we
Right.
trust
Right.
them.
So there is a certain authority component to some of the data streams, right?
Yeah, certainly, and that's how you get like high integrity data where it's
Hmm.
very valuable. And from a lot of people that I've spoken with and analyzing this stuff, it's like, yeah, these vulnerabilities that you're picking out actually are the ones that are getting hit the hardest or making the most impact, right?
Yeah.
Patrick, I want to
And
go. I just want to go back to something you
yeah,
said earlier that I disagree with, and I love you, and
oh,
it's
that's
it's a
okay.
it's a
You
healthy it's a
can,
healthy discussion, right? And you said,
yeah,
if there's exploits that are available in any capacity that we've discussed that, but that an organization should focus on those. I disagree. I think an organization should be very good operationally at working that in so that those get a priority to get fixed, so
correct.
that they can focus on improving their security architecture across the
Yes.
board. right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I mean, I know what you were saying there, right? But I want to see and I want to promote that people should not focus on vulnerabilities and exploits the way we do today. When there's a vulnerability in something, man, I heard Josh and Kurt talking about an open source security podcast, right? I agree with their saying we make a big deal about a
Oh,
vulnerability,
I
right? Even if
agree.
it's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
like that big of a
So,
deal, we tend to make a big deal about it. I'm like, hold
yeah.
on, get great operationally to focus on the smaller percentage of things that are being exploited in the wild, and
Yep.
then focus on making sure you've got a great security program, which
Yeah.
patching is like a small piece of that.
Well, and
Yeah,
and the
and I think
intersection.
a good example of that too is like it's like, yeah, you should have your Microsoft patch processes down by now.
Yeah,
Like,
agree,
so
agree.
Yeah.
yeah, maybe you want to catch the ones you miss, right? From an exploitation perspective. And then there's like, yes, the notable known exploited vulnerabilities that like, yeah, you want to surface quick and you tackle. But more or less I agree, it's like, yes, you should be focusing on your wider architecture as far as getting the bulk of things fixed. So these things get maintained and are up to date continually.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really, really do agree with you on that. I think I live in the world of like emerging threat
Sure, yeah.
exploitation,
Yeah,
right?
and that's,
So
you
Yeah.
know, that
tend
stuff's
to
important,
have a
man. Like
bias towards that.
I think that with the small percentage of things that are known to be exploited or being exploited today, you can, most organizations can pretty easily have a great process to go address those things, right? But the underpinnings of that, I got to have great asset management. Well, I think that's actually harder than vulnerability management, to be
Mm-hmm.
quite honest with
Mm-hmm.
you. Because if you don't
Yeah.
know what you have, how can you get data from anywhere that says, hey, this vulnerability is being exploited? Great. I want to go fix it, but I don't know what I have in my environment. So I might miss it.
Well, let's
Yes.
imagine you even do have it, and let's circle back to what we were talking about Microsoft says so and so says, and you mentioned, Patrick, this notion of attacker could, right? Um, I remember when I was a junior guy way back when, and I was the one handed the vuln list and told, like, hey sucker, you go tell IT and engineering that they have to do X, Y, and Z because of your little report we
That
just
doesn't
handed you,
work.
right? I remember being
Yeah.
that guy. And I remember like adamantly, but the CVSS, it says right here, attacker could, and
Yeah.
triaging and prioritizing what you tackle, right? Like to your point, Paul, there's a hygiene baseline that everybody should
Yeah.
have. I should know what I have in my Microsoft suite, and I should be doing my Microsoft updates, and I don't need to worry about attacker could. But when the rubber meets the road, and I'm going to the engineers that wrote the code, or the IT guys that have that one cranky old antique system that they don't want to touch, et cetera, like
Mm-hmm.
I better have something better than attacker could, right? And I think that's where the
Yeah.
value prop comes in.
Oh, absolutely. Like you want to have evidence to say like, hey, this threat actor is targeting this specific technology. It's been associated with ransomware. Like we need to address this or make sure there's mitigating controls in place. And I think like actually a really good example of that is like Sysakev today just put 2 Flash vulnerabilities and 2 Oracle WebLogic vulnerabilities from like 2022 on their list. And I
No,
think the Flash ones,
2013. The Flash ones were
yeah, we're from 2013 and
2013,
2014.
2014. Like, how
Wow.
do you, anyway?
But why would they do that, right? Because these technologies are still in the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Like to me, that's a signal and a reminder to say, hey, this stuff still isn't fixed. Probably is my guess. Like it's really time to get this stuff under control and fix it.
This federal website uses Adobe Flash.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe they're not using it externally, right? Maybe it's even internal, but like people need consistent reminders over time to go fix stuff. So yeah, I found those ones interesting. It's like, yeah, everyone knows that Flash is a dumpster pile as it relates to threat actors. So yeah,
Yeah,
that was a pretty
it's super
telling one.
interesting though that technology would still exist. I mean, it's super hard to even get a browser today that has Flash. Most of the modern browsers removed it 5 years ago.
Yeah, so someone's
A
using
long
IE and XP.
Yeah, so like
IE4, yeah.
if you've got Flash problems, you've got a whole host of other problems too that
Right.
need to
I mean,
be
I've had
addressed.
some conversations with like and like a good example would be like a healthcare system in some different countries where they're still running Java applications, right?
Looking at you, Ubiquity.
Yeah, so it's like it's not far off to imagine that's going on in the real world. But yeah, in I think a lot of organizations, it's like unless you're a tech company, a lot of people hold on to their tech way longer than they should, or for
It,
reasons that are good.
even the tech companies, I'm not joking. Ubiquity, Unify, the console, it's Java.
Yeah,
You have
Yeah,
to
it's
install Java to manage
Java
your
on the
Wi-Fi
client.
network with
Yeah.
Ubiquity. I'm like,
yeah,
really?
I mean, there's still
Yeah.
Java applications out there. I think what we're coming down to is that, the age of the vulnerability is not necessarily an indicator, right? That
yeah,
Fair.
attackers are going
Fair.
to go after whatever's going to help them accomplish their goals, and
yep,
we tend to be focused on what's the latest vulnerability, what's the latest exploit. Yet
yeah,
inside of our environments, and I mean, we see this from Eclipsium, inside of our environments, there's some firmware exploits that, our founders of the company discovered in 2015. And like, you can still find that on systems today. And I'm like,
Yes.
oh,
yeah.
wait a minute. Like, what do we, what, and, but, everyone again is focused on the shiny, hot new
Yeah.
thing.
Well, and I think, like, I do think too, even the shiny new hot thing, a lot of it, especially if you look at the news, right, is like people are just publishing information on every new vulnerability that comes out. And so it is incredibly noisy, like, even from
Yeah.
my perspective, and trying to sort out, like, what things should you care about and what things shouldn't. And that's a big part of, like, Kev is like, it's like, yeah, if someone's telling you that there's actual known exploitation, most of the time where there's smoke, there's fire, and you probably should just fix it.
Mm.
Is generally what I've observed from an indicator perspective. And then I think what's interesting is, having collected that, I look at a lot of, like, okay, so what are the things that are in common with these technologies that are exploited in the wild? So that's where a lot of my work around, like, categorization of
Yes.
exploited vulnerabilities, looking at the products that are impacted as
Yeah,
well.
Patrick, I had a question about local privilege escalation exploits, because this is some
Mm.
of the objections that we get when we talk about lower level EFI, UEFI type vulnerabilities and exploits. The objection is, well, an attacker has to be on the system and they have to have high privileges to then escalate even further. I'm like, well, the impact of that is certainly catastrophic because they're going to get around the operating system protections. But taking a step back, I don't think we focus enough on local privilege escalation. I think we get caught up with, if it's remotely exploitable, well, that's definitely going to get a priority. If it's local privilege escalation, even Microsoft will say, well, you should have things on your system that prevent attackers from getting there in the first place. I'm like, well, if we had that, we necessarily wouldn't need EDR anymore, right? So I think some of our
Yeah.
thinking is backwards.
Well, I think so. So certainly on the network side, like anything that is internet facing, of course, if it's RCE, like, you want to fix it.
Yeah.
Like, if someone can remotely exploit it. So I think that logic is there. But, like, yeah, as you're talking about systems, there is a decent amount of exploitation. I haven't published any of this, but I mapped to, like, the attack vector of local, for instance. And I want to say there's somewhere close to, like, maybe 15 to 20% of exploitation is a local attack vector, which is a
Mm,
decent amount, right?
yeah.
So, like, you don't want to ignore that attack vector. My theory, and I need to go down this path that you're asking. I think I was riffing with you on LinkedIn
Hmm.
and shared some of it, is like, what are the technologies most impacted there? And part of my theory there, and this is theory, maybe there's some data to validate it beyond what I have on the metric side, is that, like, a lot of this is user-based technology as well, on the local side, where they have to take an action. Um, uh, if privileges are required. So, factor is like, yes, that stuff matters. And I think it matters more, especially when you're talking about the user piece, because, like, if a user is sitting there, we see continually, like, phishing is a good example,
Yeah.
where they're targeted. So, like, PDFs delivered in email, all your wonderful attachments. And Microsoft is making, like, they made announcements about making big changes on the Office front lately, in regards to like macros and other things of that nature. But I think I really think like that's where a lot of those vulnerabilities probably play in, is when there's a lot of user interaction.
Yeah,
Um,
and also I think oftentimes an attacker doesn't require a vulnerability to exist on the system to escalate privileges. What I've seen the trend be is that they're bringing in vulnerable software. They gain a foothold on the system, and they're bringing a vulnerable driver that's installed on the system that they can then exploit to gain privileges to the next level and get
Right.
around
yeah.
EDR, because they have to, if they want to get around EDR, they have to gain higher privileges.
Well, Kerber roasting, golden ticket. There's a lot of other methods too that don't involve an
It's true.
exploit per se. I mean,
It's true.
golden tickets
Yeah.
happen. Kerber roasting
Mm-hmm.
happens. I see it all the time. I remember bragging many moons ago about, well, all my admin credentials, everybody's using MFA on the admin front. We're protected,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
yeah,
I, I mean, it goes back. Like, I think there's some fundamental, like, there always have been fundamental security issues with Microsoft. I think they're trying to make it right. I mean, they're making a lot of progress in deprecating a lot of these older technologies that have been taken advantage of. I'm trying to think of the ones lately. I want to say, like, uh, what was the authentication deprecation they were working towards? NTLM,
yeah,
maybe?
Yeah,
TLM
they did
V2.
deprecate some NTLM. Was it V2?
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. And I'm not trying to like harp on Microsoft, but it's like, yeah, you start to look at the trends of ransomware. It's like, what
Mhm.
operating system is it always associated with?
It's not
Um,
Linux.
like there's
Always
some
Windows.
It's not Mac.
like and I haven't published research on this, but it's like, yeah, I've done the heat map of all the exploited evidence, right? And what ties to ransomware, and like, man, Microsoft, I think, is a third of all CVEs, right?
Yeah,
Is
but
associated
it's not, in my opinion, it's not because it's the most vulnerable or poorly coded. It's because it's the most popular operating system. And if you think of the goals of ransomware, it's to ransom the system.
it's
And they how everyone happens to, not everyone, but a significant portion, especially in the enterprise, is running Windows.
Yeah,
it's an easy target.
yeah,
Yeah, so I think there's some aspect of prevalence, but I also think it's like there's a lot of misconfiguration
Well, because it's
and a
got a long,
lot
it
of
also is very, not, I don't want to say very old software, right? But has a long history. Therefore, Microsoft, unless they want to make a lot of customers mad, has to do this backward compatibility going, dating back to what, the
yeah.
yeah.
90s? So
And I think they're finally starting to move away and realize, like, we got to stop. Like, we have to move forward. We
yeah.
have to deprecate protocols. Like, I think that's how that revolution is happening now.
Yeah.
But
Mac
yeah, I
did this
mean,
many years ago, right? When OS X came out, Mac said, we're taking the entire what was before and we're just throwing it in the trash. We're starting from scratch, right? They declared that at the OS level. They nuked all that came before and started fresh.
They do that a
And
lot. I mean, that's Apple's MO.
yeah.
And from a security perspective, it's a very smart move.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of appealing to your user base,
Oh, good golly.
maybe not so much. I mean, when I
Yeah.
was, an Apple user, I would use the creator tools for podcasting and videos.
Yeah.
And I would upgrade, I would also have to upgrade those tools and pay more money to upgrade those tools. And I was like, oh man. But what that does is a danger that people aren't going to upgrade because they don't want to. They don't want to pay. They don't want to disrupt their
Yeah.
workflow. And then you're left being
yeah,
vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it is. I mean, like, the technology aspect is like, we have to move faster and update systems and be okay with that and understand there's implications to that too. But yeah, that's a real reality. And I'm not trying to harp on Microsoft. I just look at the data, and it's like, I would like to publish some ransomware research soon on this, because I think it's an interesting topic. Is like, yes, normally it's initial access, right, of some sort, and then it's Microsoft systems. From an attack perspective, and yes, that's the most prevalent technologies out there as well. I mean, it's not rocket science, but that there's a long history of that, and it hasn't slowed down. So I think there's some interesting, factors there as well, that like there's just not enough compensating controls.
Well,
Is the
I think prevalence is there too because I looked at the Kev data recently, just the SysAkev, and I said, create me a chart that for every company on that has a product on the Kev, if it has 10 or more vulnerabilities on the Kev, give me a chart with the number. And Microsoft was first, and that's not because Microsoft
always
sucks at security. It's
they disclose?
Microsoft has a massive amount of software, right? It's not just
Yeah.
Windows; it's other pieces of software
Yeah, there's more
as
attack
well.
surface from
There's
that
more
one
attack
company
surface.
than
So
any
I'm
other
like,
company.
okay, Microsoft's number
Well,
one. It's not a fault on
well, hey,
Microsoft,
the
just
other
data.
thing is Microsoft has been disclosing exploitation since like 2004 or earlier.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Yeah,
So
there is some like what we have visibility into
yep,
impacts the data. This is the world you live in,
correct.
Patrick, right? This is,
Yeah,
what we can
actually,
see is
funny.
what we can track, and what we can't
Yeah,
see, we're
funny
not tracking.
story though
Yeah.
is when we talk about known exploitation, like our company is a few years old. I think 2021, and so a lot of my work has been in historical exploitation. I went one weekend and read every single Microsoft advisory, and you would think that MSRC has all the exploitation evidence captured because they have a binary checkbox. Well, they only started putting in MSRC in like 2016. I
Right.
want to say I found like 120 other pieces of evidence of exploitation just from reading every single security advisory all the way back to like 2000.
Mm.
And so like that's the example of like, yes, there's exploitation evidence that even isn't captured in systems that are designed for it. Because a lot of times it's like forward moving or forward collection. But even today, like Microsoft still will sometimes disclose exploitation on a blog, and they won't update on MSRC. So a lot of times, different teams even
Hmm.
have different perspectives of the world within a same company um, uh, on that front. So yeah,
Yeah.
Microsoft's doing some great stuff. I don't want people to think like, oh,
No,
Microsoft
no.
bad just because there's a bunch of exploitation.
No, I agree. I think Microsoft is doing more than its due diligence oftentimes to
Hmm.
secure it, but also, some of that responsibility is on the user as well. And you think about, like, it's interesting to think about PK fail, right? Where companies that take in the BIOS code, right, UEFI code, and the manufacturer says, and then the provider of that says, like, do not use these certificates. They are just for testing. Like it literally says in the certificate, do not use, do
Yeah,
not test. That wasn't for the user. That
Yeah.
was for the OEMs of the world to make sure that that was there so that they did the right thing and followed the process. Similar
yeah,
things happen in Microsoft Windows world. Microsoft
Yeah.
produces the operating system. Here you go. It's a clean slate. We have this security guidance. And if people don't follow it, this is the situation we end up with. So some of that responsibility has to fall on the enterprises, on the users, the consumers of these
yeah.
technologies.
Hmm.
I'm kind of laughing because there was a Kev that popped up recently, and the security advisory was like almost a yelling statement. It was like someone said that this vulnerability has been known exploited in the wild. I wish I had it in front of me right now, and what it was. But the thing is it was, oh, I have it right here actually. The Versa Director GUI, right? Um, oh, they might have changed it actually.
Less
Uh,
snarky now.
they changed it.
They soften
Yeah,
some of
so
the
it's
language.
Somebody cautioned them.
um, yeah, it was basically like someone discovered evidence of exploitation of this. I think it was that one. It could have been a different CVE, but essentially, like their comment was like they should have read the instructions. We had this in our manual from 2015 and 2016, and if they configured it the right way, it wouldn't have been exploited.
Yeah.
So like to me, it's like, yeah, I think the challenge a lot of times with these technologies is people going to implement them. They don't read the manuals. Um, so naturally they get deployed. People have good intentions, and then it's a insecure configuration. So I do agree there's some responsibility with that, but also I think there's a track record of like so much technology just being insecure by default.
Yeah, and that's a big
Um,
initiative by CISA, secure by
Yeah.
default, but it also makes implementation that much harder.
harder.
Again, you go back to
Yeah.
the UEFI example, there are more secure by default is don't trust Microsoft's third-party CA is
Yeah.
one
Yes.
measured to be more
Yes.
secure by default. But then when a user goes to install Linux on that particular device, Linux isn't going to boot because the root of trust does not trust any of the Linux bootloaders. I'm like, oh, well, okay, yeah, it's more secure, right? But it's not that usability
It's
versus security
challenging.
thing
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
challenge. Yeah.
Well, it's
Yeah.
the ultimate secure computer. You unplug all the cables, bury it under
Yeah.
100 feet of concrete, put dogs and guns on top of it. There, it's secure now.
Yeah. And Paul, you've done a lot of implementations. You've kind of been in a sales engineering role too, like I have. We talked about that in the past, and it's like, yeah, so many of those implementations you go in, and everyone's like, just do the bare minimum so we can test it out.
Right.
And they test it out, and then like 4 months later, they come back to it and roll it into production,
Sure.
right? And so
Every
it's
developer
so
has the same story, right? Like all
Yeah,
dev
just want to
code
make it
becomes
work.
prod code, period, full
Yep.
stop.
yes,
It all goes to
yeah.
production. It just
I
does.
mean, that's the reality, and so I agree with you. Like it is difficult in regards to, you got to catch it earlier. You got to spend the time to do your due diligence, and ultimately that comes at in a factor of like work effort, time, and monitoring for these things as well.
Yeah,
Um,
you're secure by design and secure by default are great initiatives. In practice, super. I just think about
super.
using
Yep.
secrets vaults as an example. If you develop and have ever developed an application that uses secrets, there's ways that you can start prototyping and go down a path that you don't need a vault, but one little mistake, or even without that little mistake, your secrets could be vulnerable.
Hey,
And
S3 buckets are cheap, man.
implementing a vault
Uh,
is a lift, right? Depending on the situation, a moderate lift or it's a heavy lift or somewhere in between. It still requires fundamental changes. It's hard. Security is hard,
yeah.
is my point.
Authentication is probably the biggest area
Yeah.
that like to me it pains me. Like I've reported MFA bypasses. I reported recently um, a link that didn't expire that was a magic link that you could just someone forwarded me an email and it had their magic link in it and it was a marketing email and I clicked on it and logged in as them, right?
Yeah.
um for well, no, I'm not going to go there.
Yeah, we don't
um
have to name
uh,
names. Yeah.
yeah. But normally the response is we designed it this way. Like
Yeah.
that's
It's on
the way we
purpose.
designed it. That's our intention from a feature perspective, and trying to convince them that actually like no, this is really bad from a security design perspective. Is difficult. Like most of the time they're like, no, it's designed that way. It's like, well, I can bypass MFA any way I want. And they're like, yeah, that's how we wanted it to work. And so, yeah, I mean, from a security researcher perspective, that area is difficult sometimes to like try and um, reason with the people on the other side that implemented it the way that they did.
Yeah, Patrick, I want to talk about some other challenges that we have and change gears a bit and talk about supply chain vulnerabilities. There's a lot of examples, right? The one that usually sticks out in my head because I like know the person who was at the company when they disclosed it was a vulnerability in the TPM. And that vulnerability in the TPM, they tracked back to the TPM chip manufacturer and they said, we don't support this product anymore. But it was in an OEM's laptop. And you go back to that OEM, I won't name names, right? But go back to that OEM and then they say there's a vulnerability. Now that OEM has to go back to the original manufacturer of the chip. Is so like in the meantime, is it a TPM chip manufacturer vulnerability? Is it an OEM vulnerability? Does it where is how do we track a lot of these supply chain vulnerabilities that are out there? And it put it in a software context for a moment too. There's a vulnerable component. That component's used by other software inside of that other software. So
Yeah.
is it a vulnerability in the component and all these other things are vulnerable? How do we track these? Right? I mean, you're in the
Well,
business of tracking vulnerabilities. This is a
yeah,
huge
yeah,
challenge.
yeah. So I think open source is common. So you
Yeah.
mentioned hardware and then open source. Like
Yeah.
I anything that like poses, I look at it like from a vulnerability perspective, like, hey, if it's legit real CVE program, as far as like getting a CVE associated with it, so there's an identifier and that information is out there, it is like the best place to like centralize information regarding a vulnerability
Do we
from a tracking
populate
perspective.
CPE with all the software that incorporates that component?
Well, yes and no.
Because CPE
Like,
is kind of it's I don't want to say it's a hot mess, but it's not well maintained today. Is that
it's what we have.
it's what we have, but
Yeah,
it's not well,
yeah.
because who's supposed to be maintaining CPE? Is it NVD or is it First or is it
Well, we do.
a hot potato? Yeah, so that's the thing.
Yeah,
It's like a
yeah.
hot potato until you land on someone that does want to take it on and help update it.
Yeah, I mean, in the identifier world, like open source software, you're going to have pearls. On the proprietary side, CPE is more the standard.
Sure.
And so, yeah, that you have NVD that historically had been doing this, and then NVD kind of crapped out for a while. And then you had CISA doing some on vulnerable, and then you have CNAs submitting CVE numbering authorities, CPE. And just so everyone knows, common platform enumeration. And genuinely on our side, it's like, well, yeah, the quality is inconsistent across all of these. And so, what Jake, our CTO, did, and some of our engineers is they actually spun up a project. We were planning on doing it anyway, even without the NVD stuff, so kind of convenient timing. But rather than trying to do this manually, like we essentially take the information we get off all the security advisories to generate that and then validate it via the NVD or NIST's CP dictionary. It's not an easy thing to do. Nobody wants to do that work.
And when you say that, Patrick, I track it manually for select vulnerabilities that I'm tracking as part of my day job, right? So
yeah.
I will see that regression, right? SSH vulnerability, clearly a vulnerability in SSH. However, I'm tracking all the feeds from network device and appliance manufacturers, and I'll spot, vendor XYZ released an update for their product in either states, like we fixed this regression vulnerability, or we're just putting it out there that this product is not affected. So what you're saying is, if you consume all that data, you can build a CPE that has more contextual information, which I think is extremely valuable.
Yeah, and that's essentially like getting the information from the source is key.
Yeah.
Even if an intermediary like CVE program, which is awesome, right? It's another data entry point that then is going to have inconsistencies. So the further you go down the stack, like I think what NVD was doing well at it was they cleaned up a lot of the information so it was a lot more consumable at scale. NIST NVD. CVE program is now working a lot to try and do that earlier in the process. But if you look at the CVE program, like most fields are like open text that you can put in with no validation.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that makes it really hard to consume that information because there's no checks or balances of like, did they even put this information in the right field?
Yeah.
Is it in the right format? Is it consistent with the 500, I think it's 400 other CNAs that are submitting information? You can guess when 400 different companies submit information via open text field, what happens, right?
Mm-hmm. Nirvana ends up being a combination of a NoSQL approach, right? Coupled with, multi-dimensional NoSQL, right? Coupled with everybody has an HBOM and an SBOM, right? To Paul's point, like I was thinking of years ago, I don't even know if they're still around, Open Source Software Institute used to take OpenSSL and run it through the FIPS validation process, the FIPS 140-2 validation. And so you could get a version of OpenSSL that was FIPS validated.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knew if that was the OpenSSL you were using versus the off-the-shelf one. Like how do you let's imagine that a known vulnerability hit the FIPS version. You're cheesed. You're completely cheesed. You have no clue on planet Earth where or who or what.
Well, I think Alan, that's definitely a great answer to my question too. Is SBOMs are a way?
Like SBOM, HBOM, and NoSQL multi-dimensional database, where literally I can say at any point in that 4-dimensional array, like, this is the problem. Here's the 15 products using it. Here's the 15 products that created it. Here's the, you need all those vectors. Like, that's the answer.
Open source, though, I think that works, but I think we have a larger problem in commercial software.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw an example of this with Zixil released some vulnerabilities. And one of their vulnerabilities I traced back to a commercial component. And is that going to be in their SBOM? Does it violate their agreement with who they're licensing that software to?
Mm-hmm.
That's where it gets really tricky, is how do you create an SBOM for commercial software? I guess if you're using commercial component, you could tag it, but everyone have to agree on a standard on how to tag it. In open source world, there's a lot more open standards.
Yeah, there's a
right?
lot of work being done in that area and encouraging. Like, I think CISA and the government are trying to force vendors to supply an SBOM of what software they have inside of the proprietary product. So, and then there's different standards as far as format. But we're at least seeing the start of that and a lot more interest in people participating. I think Schneider Electric is champion. It's kind of interesting, but like,
we interviewed
medical devices.
Who do we interview from Schneider Electric?
We talked to
Schneider. She's doing great work. I can't remember her name.
She had some amazing stuff. That's right.
It's a previous below the surface episode. She's awesome. Now I can't remember her name either. Al and I are both blanking on her.
Yeah. She was awesome. She was smart, sharp, had a whole program together, had written books. Like the Schneider's on top of it is the conclusion I came to.
Correct. Yeah, I agree. They're the model for other commercial companies to be publishing these the SBOMs and disclosing what components make them up, so that when we do discover a vulnerability in something, we can be more diligent about going, well, I only don't have that component, but wait, I do, because I have this other software that incorporates it. That's the challenge I think we have today. Again, it comes back to asset inventory, right? And figuring out what you have is not just what you have, but what's inside of what you have.
HBOM, SBOM, universal, right? Somehow, some way, commercial, open source, the slightly modified open source that then becomes its own standard, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's a whole
I've experienced in what we do at Eclipsing, the deeper you go, the worse that gets. I mean, thankfully, our software, shameless plug, right, is really good at that, so that I can discover on my machine. Most tools are like, yeah, your machine scans clean. Like you're pretty up to date, right? I run a rolling release Linux distro. Like they're up to date. When I dig deeper and I scan it with our product, they're like, your AMD processor has 2 vulnerabilities. You know that, right?
Oh yeah.
Again, that's that deep asset catalog and knowing, what's beneath that surface. And of course, all of that is proprietary, right? You
busted me.
Yeah, Alan had the same thing. We both experienced the same thing at Eclipsing. We're like, oh, like these deep, low-level proprietary
vulnerabilities.
Vulnerabilities do exist.
I had a BIOS.
You just look for them, right?
That was not, in fact, from the manufacturer.
Some of them are.
Really?
Of them, again, are supply chain vulnerabilities that have come in. Like I gave the TPM is a prime example, right?
Yeah. I haven't kicked the tires in that area myself. I'm always doing like network scanning, and then host scanning. But same thing. It's always like, there's nothing on here to see. I think my home network is a good example as well. And it's like, come on.
And that's
I want to see a little bit more.
It's one of my questions that I've floated recently is that, when we look at these lower level components that contain vulnerabilities, and then we start looking at malware, how deep have we looked at malware to see if they are actually using these techniques in things that are below the operating system, just as an example, right? I want to study where we study more of the malware to see more of what it's doing. I think a lot of the malware work going on today is just figuring out what the attacker is doing, not really looking into their whole toolkit. Maybe I could be wrong because I don't work in malware reverse engineering or analysis world. I know there's companies that specialize in that, and I'm curious, like, do we have problems we don't know about because we're not looking in some of these areas?
There's 2 starts in that world. One is the malicious actor could and reverse engineer from there, right? We know we have this weird quirk over here. A bad guy could, in theory, exploit the quirk. So let's start with the quirk and try to be the bad guy that exploits it. And the other one is be the bad guy and come in and see what you find and start with your own methodology, right? There's 2 complete different approaches to that. And that front to back and back to front perspective is very. It's not as simple as attacker versus defender, right? It's both models in both heads, right?
Right.
I mean, it has to be. I used to be a pen tester. I used to be, I was on Team Evil for a while there.
Yeah.
The other piece is like, what can you actually detect? Like, it's going to be hard for you to detect, right? An
Correct.
attack on a processor.
Right.
And I think that's part of it too, is when I'm looking at exploitation evidence and I'm mapping it out, it's like, oh, interesting. Like, EPSS is a good example. Typically, if I start looking at things that are known exploited and mapping out why they have a high EPSS scores, it's because they have detections in the products that EPSS is built on,
Right.
right? So I think a lot of times too, there's a concept of like, even with known exploitation, like we're blind to a lot of things that are going on, likely, that we don't see because nobody is actually able to detect or see this attack, or
Right.
there's not detection artifacts yet.
Well, some of the
Um,
threat model is different. And we've published about this, and I have not fully delved into this world, but the big population of folks that are going after below the OS exploits in bootloaders, EFI, and UEFI is gamers. And they're
Yeah.
doing it to get around the anti-cheat
Yeah.
modules that are built in the
yeah,
kernel because they
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
to get
They're
around the low-level
always the
kernel
gamers,
protection. It's
dude.
always the
Yep.
gamers.
The
And
original crackers were all
I'm
gamers,
like,
right? Like
man,
that's, I mean, that's where all
the
the
thing is
cracking
too,
of,
like I'm gonna talk about this tonight too, but like they're not nation states. These are gamers. And most people think these lower level complex exploits are as nation state level attacking. And I'm like, really? I'm like, gamers are nation states? I'm like, because they're doing this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I mean the gaming community certainly, like, people want an advantage, they want to get ahead, there's incentive to do it.
Right.
yeah.
Certainly, creative, there's programming involved in most of the games nowadays as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the skill level gets really, really high. So yeah, certainly, an area I think that, some of this activity certainly, we see come from at times.
Patrick, my last question for you is one that I think I asked Jane Wade when they came on the show, and others when we talk about this topic, and that is, how do we classify an exploit, a vulnerability chain, and associated exploit chain? How do we go, yes, the like severity and impact of this one vulnerability is measured like individually, but
Yeah.
if this other vulnerability were to be there and maybe an associated exploit together, now both the severity and
Yeah.
impact exponentially increases. I don't
Yep.
correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we have great ways to track this. And I've asked this question of a lot of people. No one seems to be like, I don't think we're really great at that yet.
Well, I don't think we're great at it. We do collect exploit chains.
Mm-hmm.
There's not that much evidence. Like, there's not a whole lot of evidence either, um, out there. So, like, part of it is how much information do you have to even research and look at exploit chains? And then, yeah, I think it's okay. Yeah, if you take these things, this is how you're going to get results. It's likely, there's probably a lot more of it than we see. But I think, yeah, it's more or less like, hey, I'm living on the land, right? Like using one exploit to get in this system, and then elevating
Yeah.
privileges, and then doing something else.
You know what we need to do? We
Um,
need to get every single pen test report that's ever created, stuff it in an LLM, and have it figure out which mixture of vulnerabilities is the worst.
yeah,
If used in this
yeah.
13-step process.
Right.
Well, I don't. Did you see the report that CISA published this week with the MITRE ATT&CK techniques?
Mm-hmm.
I did not.
Because I think that was an attempt to like try and point out some things. I do want to ask them a few questions I have, because I was a little bit confused. Like, did they really test every technique, right? Or did they just test one, and if that was successful, they gave up and moved on? Because
Yeah.
the data kind of showed me, like, what I saw was like there was certainly a ton of credential compromise, which isn't a surprise.
Mm,
But like my guess is like there was so much credential compromise compared to other things because like they moved on to the next step because they compromised the system.
right. Right.
But yeah, it wasn't clear. I didn't read it in great detail, but that was kind of some of my theories on why certain areas were so high and certain areas are so low. But we're still sitting here where like most pen tests are credential compromise,
Yep.
and it's 2024.
Yeah, and that's MITRE ATT&CK is a great way to track though. We talked a lot about vulnerabilities. Obviously, MITRE ATT&CK is more based on techniques, largely based on all techniques, not individual vulnerabilities. So, yeah, that's a great point. And we interviewed Adam Pennington, who leads up the MITRE attack over at MITRE. Patrick, I just want to thank you for coming on the show and tell our audience, make sure you follow Patrick on LinkedIn and follow the VulnCheck blog. You produce a lot of, I think, great data. Even though
Thanks.
sometimes it sparks debate, I think that's healthy. I think,
That's good.
publishing
I'm
data
not.
and
Hey, I
having the
always tell
discussion,
people it's
right?
like
It's important.
I'm not always right. I try and ask interesting questions, look at the data, and come to conclusions and share those observations. And you try and be right most of the time, but yeah, a lot of times it's all about learning as well, where people have different insights, perspectives, and it incites great conversation on social with the community, which has been a lot of fun. And that's some of the way I learn too. So,
right.
Yep.
Yeah,
Stepping outside of these dialogues, Patrick is fun to follow on LinkedIn, period.
Oh,
like
yeah,
not even
absolutely.
on these topics. It's
No,
just
I agree.
follow Patrick on LinkedIn. He's a fun read.
Awesome. Patrick, thanks again for coming on Below the Surface.
Appreciate it. Take care.
With that, we will conclude this episode. Thanks everyone for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.